Did you know that the most common type of accident in business aviation is the runway excursion? These types of adverse events involve departing the side or end of a runway, with about 80% of these events occurring during attempts at landing. In this video, we'll discuss factors that increase the likelihood of a runway excursion, review some traditional risk mitigation recommendations, and show you Garmin features that have the potential to reduce the risk of a runway excursion. There are a number of factors that contribute to runway excursion events. These include continuing from an unstabilized approach to a landing, high airport elevations, which result in increased ground speeds, carrying excess airspeed or altitude over the runway threshold, landing beyond the touchdown zone, landing on wet or contaminated runway surfaces, landing with a tailwind, heavy landing weights, and downhill runway slopes. Most pilots are aware that a safe landing begins long before touching down on the runway surface. Adhering to company or personal standards for aircraft configuration, airspeeds, glide path, and rate of descent provides the best opportunity for a safe landing. The aircraft should be in the landing configuration early in the approach, with landing checklist items completed. This keeps the number of variables to a minimum during final approach. A glide path of 3 degrees is optimal for most approaches, and you can use electronic guidance when available for instrument approaches. With certain Garmin devices, you also have the option to load and execute visual approaches, which provide lateral and vertical guidance to the touchdown zone of a runway. Trying to save a landing from an unstable approach has led to far too many runway excursions. So if you haven't met your stabilized approach criteria by at least 500 feet above the runway, you should execute a go-around and come back for another attempt. And if you carry too much altitude or airspeed into the approach and find yourself floating past the first third of the runway, go around. Otherwise, you may just run out of runway before coming to a stop. The reference landing approach speed, or VREF, is the speed to be at when crossing the threshold. VREF is 1.3 times the stall speed for the aircraft weight and configuration. This airspeed is then adjusted upwards for factors such as wind gusts, wind shear, or icing. VREF is the minimum airspeed to maintain during approach. Many aircraft manufacturers publish specific airspeeds to maintain until nearing the threshold, so be sure to reference those speeds for your aircraft. For gusty conditions, the FAA recommends adding 50% of the gust factor to your speed, so if winds were reported at 10 knots gusting to 20 knots, you would add 5 knots to your final approach speed. When wind shear is reported or experienced, the best course of action would be to divert to another airport. But if that isn't possible, then you may need to add 15 to 20 knots to VREF, based on the expected wind shear value. If you have experienced icing accretion in flight, you should refer to the aircraft AFM for configuration limitations and recommended airspeeds to be flown. A Garmin product that has the potential to significantly improve management of landing approaches is the GI 260 Angle of Attack, or AOA, indicator system. While typical GA pilots learn to fly approaches based solely on airspeed indications, military and other pilots integrate AOA indications to ensure the approach and landing are on speed. For a given weight and configuration, there is an on-speed AOA and airspeed. An AOA indicator or indication is a great backup because it provides AOA at a single glance, with some systems also providing an audio alert during critical flight phases. The Garmin AOA indicator provides this information as it shows green bars coming from the bottom of the device as angle of attack approaches the approach AOA reference, shown by the green circle towards the center of the device. at increasing angles of attack above the green circular reference, yellow lines and downward pointing chevrons, first in solid yellow and then in flashing red, indicate that you need to lower the nose of the aircraft to decrease the angle of attack. In addition, tones are associated with the yellow and red alert levels to provide additional awareness of the high angle of attack condition. On certain Garmin integrated flight decks equipped with synthetic vision and an AOA sensor, you will see a dynamic approach speed cue. This visual cue represents the approximate VREF speed based on the weight and configuration of the aircraft. Keeping an eye on this cue and crossing the threshold at the airspeed shown by the cue can help to ensure a landing in the AFM calculated landing distance. An important factor to keep in mind when operating at high altitude airports is that your ground speed will be significantly higher during landing when compared to landings at low altitude airports. The higher ground speed drives the need for longer runways than when at lower altitudes. An important thing to consider when determining your landing distance required is what the conditions will be at your time of arrival. If the runway is wet or contaminated, you'll need to add the required distance. For example, this chart shows 2,200 feet for a dry runway, 3,800 feet for a wet runway, and 4,550 feet for a runway with 1/8 inch standing water. If you had to land with a tailwind, you would need to multiply your runway condition factored numbers by yet another factor. While you can obtain airport condition information from ATIS broadcasts and from ATC, for en route planning, you could also benefit from viewing METAR and TAF information for precipitation at your destination airport. An examination of any aircraft AFM performance section clearly shows the effect of weight on landing distances. Under a certain set of conditions, a heavy aircraft will touch down at a higher speed, and due to higher momentum, will require more distance to brake to a stop. Another factor that affects landing distance is runway slope. AFMs typically show information for a paved, level, dry runway, and may not show an adjustment factor for runway slope. A downhill slope of 1% increases landing distances by 10%. You should take runway slope into consideration when determining your landing distance. You can look up performance data in your airplane flight manual, or on certain Garmin systems, use the TOLD function to determine your landing distance and enter your landing runway. This TOLD function is also used for determining takeoff distances required. If the runway is too short, the system will let you know. Before conducting an approach, you should review information about the length of the runways available, and look for notes about runway slope. With calm winds, it makes sense to land uphill to reduce your landing roll. With recent systems that have synthetic vision and surface watch enabled, if the selected runway has an available landing or takeoff distance less than determined by the TOLD function, you will see a runway too short warning annunciation, and here,
runway too short.
Commercial operators use a dispatch landing distance that allows the aircraft to land and stop within 60% of the available runway when the surface is dry. The factored landing distance in this case is 1.67 times the certified landing distance. For wet surfaces, this becomes a factor of 1.92. Slush and snow both require additional distance factors. With the admirable safety record achieved by commercial operators, it's easy to see that using similar factors for any flight operation can improve safety. Having more runway than you need is always better than not having enough. Okay, that wraps up our discussion of ways to reduce the risk of a runway excursion. Be sure to check out additional information on this subject in the documents that are linked in the description for this video. We encourage you to continue your safety journey by viewing the other videos in the Garmin Aviation Risk Management series. And thanks for flying Garmin.